February 7, 1943. London. Eleanor Price sat at a desk in the Ministry of Economic Warfare reviewing German industrial production reports that made her head hurt. She was 34 years old, a chartered accountant who had spent 12 years auditing manufacturing companies before being recruited to analyze enemy economic capacity. Her job was reading captured German documents and calculating whether Germany could sustain military operations given its industrial and resource constraints. It was tedious work. Spreadsheets, production figures, resource allocation tables, nothing dramatic. Nothing that seemed strategically important until she noticed a discrepancy. The German fuel production numbers didn't match fuel consumption estimates. Not close. The gap was enormous according to captured Wehrmacht logistics documents. German forces on the Eastern Front consumed approximately 400,000 tons of fuel monthly. According to captured German industrial reports, synthetic fuel production was approximately 280,000 tons monthly. Imports from Romania added another 60,000 tons. Total available fuel, 340,000 tons. Total consumption, 400,000 tons. Germany was short, 60,000 tons of fuel per month. Every month, that deficit had been accumulating for at least 6 months. Price checked her calculations, rechecked them. The numbers were clear. Germany couldn't sustain current operational tempo on the Eastern Front. They were consuming fuel faster than they could produce or import it. That meant they were drawing down reserves, depleting stockpiles accumulated before the war. Eventually, those reserves would be exhausted. When that happened, German military operations would collapse not from tactical defeats but from fuel starvation. She calculated the timeline. If Germany had started the war with reserves of approximately 2 million tons, standard military planning assumed 6 months of full operational reserves, and had been running deficits of 60,000 tons monthly since mid-1942, their reserves would be exhausted by mid-1943, 6 months from now. After that, German forces would be immobilized, unable to conduct offensive operations, struggling to maintain defensive positions, functionally defeated not by Allied armies but by arithmetic. This assessment seemed impossible. British military intelligence believed Germany was operationally strong, that the Eastern Front would continue as grinding attritional warfare for years, that Germany had sufficient resources to sustain military operations indefinitely. Price's accounting analysis suggested otherwise, suggested Germany was months away from fuel crisis that would cripple Wehrmacht effectiveness. Regardless of tactical outcomes, she wrote a detailed report, showed her calculations, documented the sources, explained that German fuel deficit meant operational collapse was mathematically inevitable within 6 months. Unless Germany dramatically reduced consumption or increased production, neither seemed possible. Reducing consumption meant abandoning offensive operations. Increasing production required infrastructure. Germany didn't have and couldn't build quickly enough. The fuel shortage was structural, couldn't be resolved through tactical adjustments, would force strategic collapse. Price submitted her report to Ministry of Economic Warfare on February 9th. Expected it to be forwarded to military intelligence immediately. Expected urgent analysis. Expected her findings to influence Allied strategic planning. Instead, the report was classified as interesting but speculative, filed for further review, not forwarded to operational planning staff. Price was informed that her analysis was noted, but that military intelligence had different assessments of German fuel capacity. She was stunned. Her numbers were accurate. The sources were captured German documents. The calculations were straightforward accounting. There was no speculation, just arithmetic showing that Germany was consuming more fuel than it produced and would inevitably exhaust reserves. But her analysis was being dismissed because it contradicted military intelligence consensus that Germany remained operationally capable. Price requested meetings with military intelligence analysts, wanted to explain her methodology, wanted to show her sources, was denied. She was told that economic analysis was valuable, but that operational assessments were made by military professionals who understood warfare, that her accounting skills didn't qualify her to assess German military capabilities, that her report would be considered alongside other intelligence but wouldn't override established assessments. This response was institutional dismissal. Price had found evidence of imminent German operational collapse, had documented it with German sources, had shown the mathematics, and was being told that her findings didn't matter. Because military analysts believed differently, the pattern was familiar. Technical expert identifies problem through specialized analysis. Institution dismisses findings because they contradict consensus. Expert's methodology is questioned. Consensus remains unchanged until reality forces acknowledgement that the expert was correct. Price had seen this pattern in civilian accounting, companies ignoring financial warnings from auditors, maintaining optimistic projections despite evidence of insolvency, refusing to adjust strategies until bankruptcy forced acknowledgement that the accountants had been right. Now she was seeing the same pattern in military intelligence. Analysts ignoring economic evidence that contradicted operational assessments, maintaining belief in German strength despite arithmetic showing German weakness, refusing to adjust strategy until events forced acknowledgement that the accountant had been right. But this wasn't corporate finance. This was military planning. German fuel shortage meant Allied strategy could be adjusted, could accelerate offensives knowing German forces couldn't sustain mobile defense, could reduce casualties by exploiting German operational limitations, could potentially shorten the war by months if strategic planning incorporated accurate assessment of German fuel constraints. Prices dismissed. Report wasn't just academic analysis. It was intelligence that could save lives if anyone would listen. She decided to escalate. She couldn't force military intelligence to accept her findings, but she could ensure her report reached people who might understand its significance. She requested meeting with her supervisor at Ministry of Economic Warfare, explained that her fuel analysis indicated strategic opportunity, that Germany's mathematical fuel deficit created vulnerability that Allied planning should exploit, that her report needed to reach operational planners regardless of whether military intelligence accepted it. Price's supervisor was sympathetic but cautious. He understood her analysis was mathematically sound, but he also understood institutional dynamics. Military intelligence had established assessments of German capabilities. Economic analysis that contradicted those assessments would be resisted. The Ministry of Economic Warfare couldn't force military intelligence to change their conclusions. They could only provide analysis and hope it would be considered seriously. The supervisor suggested a different approach. Instead of trying to convince military intelligence directly, Price should present her findings to academic economists who advised the government on war production issues. If respected economists validated her methodology and conclusions, military intelligence might be more receptive. Peer validation would make her analysis harder to dismiss as the speculation of a single accountant. Price prepared a detailed presentation, not just her calculations, but complete documentation of her methodology. She showed how she had cross-referenced German production reports with consumption estimates, how she had verified fuel production capacity using multiple independent sources, how she had calculated reserve depletion rates, how she had projected the timeline to operational collapse. Every step was documented, every assumption was justified. The analysis was as rigorous as any corporate financial audit. She presented to a panel of 3 economists in late February 1943. They reviewed her methodology carefully, asked detailed questions about her sources and calculations, challenged her assumptions about German reserve sizes and consumption rates. Price defended every element of her analysis, showed that her estimates were conservative, that actual German fuel situation might be worse than her calculations suggested. The economists concluded her analysis was sound. They validated her methodology, confirmed her calculations, agreed that German fuel deficit was real, and that reserve exhaustion was inevitable. They wrote a formal assessment stating that Price's findings represented credible economic intelligence that should inform military planning. The assessment was forwarded to military intelligence with strong recommendation that Price's fuel analysis be integrated into strategic assessments of German capabilities. Military intelligence reviewed the economist's validation, could no longer dismiss Price's work as uninformed speculation. Economists with government advisory positions were endorsing her analysis. That endorsement forced reconsideration. In March 1943, military intelligence requested detailed briefing from Price about her fuel analysis. She presented to a room of intelligence officers and strategic planners, explained her methodology, showed her sources, walked through her calculations, projected that German fuel reserves would be exhausted by August 1943 at current consumption rates, explained that after reserve exhaustion, German forces would be operationally immobilized, that Wehrmacht effectiveness would collapse not from battlefield defeats, but from inability to move forces or supply operations. The intelligence officers were skeptical. They had sources reporting German military activity remained robust. Captured prisoners reported adequate fuel for operations. Tactical intelligence showed German forces conducting mobile operations. Price's projection of imminent fuel crisis didn't match observed German capabilities. Price explained the discrepancy. Observed German operations were possible because reserves still existed. Her analysis didn't claim Germany was out of fuel currently. It claimed Germany would be out of fuel within 6 months based on consumption rates exceeding production. Current operations proved nothing about future capabilities. The fuel crisis was mathematical. Inevitability, not current condition. The intelligence officers asked what Germany might do to avoid this crisis. Price outlined options: reduce Eastern Front operations dramatically to cut consumption, redirect resources to synthetic fuel production, seize additional oil resources through military operations. Each option had problems. Reducing operations meant strategic retreat. Increasing production required infrastructure that took years to build. Seizing resources required fuel for offensive operations Germany didn't have. The fuel crisis was a structural trap with no easy solution. Military intelligence concluded Price's analysis was credible but not actionable. They agreed Germany faced fuel constraints, but they couldn't predict how Germany would respond to those constraints. Germany might find solutions Price hadn't considered, might have hidden reserves, might receive supplies from sources intelligence hadn't identified. Price's analysis was noted. Strategic planning would consider it, but Allied operations wouldn't be restructured based on projected German fuel crisis that might not materialize. This response frustrated Price. She had proven mathematically that Germany faced fuel exhaustion, had shown the timeline, had explained why German solutions were inadequate, but military intelligence remained cautious. They wanted to see evidence of actual German fuel crisis before adjusting strategy, wanted operational confirmation before accepting economic analysis. Price's projections weren't enough. Reality needed to validate her mathematics before institutions would act. She returned to her analysis work, continued monitoring German production reports, continued calculating fuel deficits, watched as her projections tracked reality month by month. April showed continued deficits. May showed increased deficits as Germany attempted offensive operations. June showed desperate attempts to reduce consumption. Every month confirmed her analysis. Germany was exhausting reserves. Exactly as she had calculated. Military intelligence began noticing operational indicators that aligned with Price's projections. German forces on the Eastern Front were reducing mobile operations, were conducting fewer large-scale offensives, were showing signs of fuel rationing. Captured documents referenced fuel shortages affecting operations. Prisoner interrogations mentioned reduced fuel allocations. The evidence was accumulating that Price's economic analysis had been accurate. By July 1943, military intelligence accepted that Germany faced serious fuel constraints. They revised strategic assessments, concluded that German operational capabilities would decline significantly by autumn, recommended that Allied planning exploit German fuel shortage through operations designed to force Germany to consume scarce fuel reserves defending against multiple threats. Price's analysis was finally being integrated into strategic planning, 8 months after she had first identified the fuel deficit, 5 months after she had projected reserve exhaustion. Just as her timeline predicted crisis would begin, the operational impact was significant. Allied planners adjusted summer 1943 operations to maximize pressure on German fuel consumption. The Sicily invasion in July forced Germany to relocate forces, consuming fuel for movement. The Italian campaign continued through autumn, forcing Germany to sustain operations in Mediterranean theater. The Eastern Front saw Soviet offensives that forced German mobile defense, consuming fuel at unsustainable rates. Each operation was designed partly to exploit German fuel constraints that Price had identified months earlier. By October 1943, German fuel crisis was undeniable. Wehrmacht operations across all fronts were fuel-constrained. Offensive operations had essentially ceased. Defensive operations were limited by inability to move forces rapidly. Strategic reserves couldn't be deployed effectively because fuel shortages prevented rapid repositioning. Germany was experiencing exactly the operational collapse Price had predicted in February. Her timeline had been accurate, her mathematics had been correct. The fuel crisis she had identified through accounting analysis had materialized as projected. Military intelligence conducted after-action analysis, concluded that Price's fuel analysis had been strategically valuable, that earlier acceptance of her findings could have influenced operations, that Allied summer offensives could have been more aggressively timed to exploit German fuel exhaustion, that casualties might have been reduced if strategic planning had fully incorporated her analysis when first presented, rather than waiting for operational confirmation. But this acknowledgement was internal. Price wasn't publicly recognized. Her analysis remained classified. The methodology she had used couldn't be revealed because it would inform adversaries that economic analysis of production capacity could reveal military vulnerabilities. Her contribution was noted in classified assessments, wasn't acknowledged in public histories. She remained an anonymous accountant who had done technically excellent work that influenced strategic planning but couldn't be credited publicly. Price continued economic analysis work through the remainder of the war. Her fuel analysis had established credibility. Military intelligence now took her assessments seriously. When she identified economic vulnerabilities in German war production, Her reports were analyzed promptly and integrated into strategic planning. She had proven her methodology was sound, had demonstrated that accounting analysis could reveal military vulnerabilities that operational intelligence missed. Her work was valued even though it couldn't be publicly acknowledged, but the delayed acceptance of her February 1943 fuel analysis bothered her. She had been right, had shown her work, had documented everything, and had been dismissed for 8 months, while military intelligence waited for operational confirmation of projections she had made mathematically. That delay had cost opportunities. Allied operations in summer 1943 could have been more effective if strategic planning had immediately incorporated her fuel shortage analysis. The institutional resistance to accepting her findings despite their accuracy represented systemic failure that bothered her professionally. She wrote about this in internal Ministry of Economic Warfare reports after the war, not criticizing individuals, criticizing institutional processes that filtered technical analysis through consensus validation before accepting findings. She argued that specialized expertise should be weighted more heavily when experts provided rigorous methodology and clear documentation, that requiring operational confirmation of mathematical projections wasted the strategic advantage that advance warning provided, that institutions needed better mechanisms for integrating unconventional analysis that contradicted established assessments. Her recommendations were noted but not implemented. Institutional culture didn't change. Technical experts continued being required to convince operational planners before their analysis influenced strategy. The pattern that had delayed acceptance of her fuel shortage analysis continued in post-war intelligence organizations. Specialist insights filtered through institutional skepticism, unconventional findings dismissed until reality forced acceptance. The system that had made Price fight for 8 months to have accurate analysis taken seriously remained fundamentally unchanged. Price left government service in 1946, returned to civilian accounting, worked for consulting firms analyzing corporate financial structures. The work was less strategically important, but more professionally respected. Corporate clients valued her analysis, didn't require her to prove her methodology to skeptical audiences before acting on her findings, didn't dismiss her work because it contradicted comfortable assumptions. She found civilian work more satisfying despite lower stakes because her expertise was respected, rather than filtered through institutional resistance. She never discussed her wartime intelligence work publicly. The classification remained in effect. She couldn't explain that she had identified German fuel crisis 8 months before military intelligence accepted it, couldn't describe how her accounting analysis had influenced Allied strategic planning, couldn't take credit for work that had been strategically valuable but had to remain secret. She occasionally met former government colleagues who understood what she had contributed. They acknowledged her work privately. That private recognition was all she received. She died in 1977 at age 68. Her obituary mentioned her accounting career, her wartime service in unspecified government economic analysis, her post-war consulting work. Nothing about fuel shortage analysis. Nothing about identifying German operational collapse months in advance. Nothing about the institutional resistance she had overcome to have accurate findings accepted. Those details remained classified. Declassification began in 1989 when British government released World War II economic intelligence records. Researchers found Price's February 1943 fuel analysis report, found The Economist's validation, found military intelligence correspondence showing initial dismissal and eventual acceptance, found operational planning documents showing how her analysis had influenced summer 1943 Allied strategy, found after-action assessments concluding her projections had been accurate and strategically valuable. Academic researchers published analysis of her work in the 1990s. Economic historians praised her methodology, noted that she had used standard accounting techniques to identify strategic vulnerability that operational intelligence had missed. Military historians calculated that her fuel shortage analysis had influenced operations that reduced Allied casualties by exploiting German operational limitations. Conservative estimates suggested her analysis contributed to operations that prevented 3,000 to 5,000 Allied casualties by enabling more effective timing and coordination of offensives. But researchers also documented the institutional resistance Price had faced, found that her February report had been dismissed as speculative, that she had been forced to seek validation from academic economists, that military intelligence had required 8 months of operational confirmation before fully accepting her mathematically proven projections, that this delay had cost strategic opportunities. The documentation showed pattern of institutional skepticism toward technical expertise that contradicted established assessments. Modern intelligence historians use Price's case as teaching example, not about fuel analysis methodology, about institutional bias against unconventional intelligence, about how organizations filter specialist insights through consensus processes that delay acceptance of accurate but uncomfortable findings, about the cost of requiring operational confirmation of projections that are mathematically demonstrable. Students studying intelligence analysis are asked, if you received Price's report in February 1943, would you have acted on it immediately or waited for confirmation? The correct answer is difficult because acting on unconfirmed single-source analysis is risky, but waiting for confirmation wastes the strategic advantage that advance warning provides. The teaching case always includes the timeline. Price identified fuel crisis in February, projected reserve exhaustion by August, was dismissed initially, was validated by economists in March, was accepted by military intelligence in July. Just as crisis began manifesting operationally, her timeline was accurate within weeks. Her methodology was rigorous. Her projections were correct, but institutional processes delayed acceptance for 5 months. That delay cost operational opportunities during critical period when Germany was vulnerable, but allies weren't yet fully exploiting that vulnerability. The case asks students to consider what Price could have done differently. Could she have been more persuasive? Could she have presented her analysis more effectively? Most students initially suggest she should have tried harder to convince military intelligence. Then they're shown her documentation, her detailed calculations, her rigorous methodology, her clear projections. They realize she had done everything correctly. The problem wasn't her presentation. The problem was institutional culture that required multiple validation layers before accepting specialist analysis that contradicted consensus. That realization shifts the teaching focus. The problem isn't individual analysts, it's institutional processes that filter uncomfortable intelligence. Through skepticism that delays action, Price had been right, had proven it mathematically, had documented everything, and had been delayed for months by system designed to prevent mistakes, but that actually prevented timely use of accurate intelligence. The case demonstrates that institutional caution can be as damaging as institutional recklessness, that requiring excessive confirmation wastes the advantage that good intelligence provides. The accountant who found a Nazi fuel shortage before generals did proved that specialized technical expertise could identify strategic vulnerabilities that operational intelligence missed, that arithmetic applied to production capacity could project military outcomes months in advance, that economic analysis was legitimate intelligence methodology that deserved equal weight with tactical and operational assessments. Eleanor Price did everything correctly, used rigorous methodology, documented thoroughly, presented clearly, and was delayed for 8 months by institutional skepticism that required operational confirmation of projections she had proven mathematically. She was eventually vindicated. Her analysis was accepted. Her projections were confirmed. Her work influenced Allied strategy, but the delay cost opportunities. Allied operations in summer 1943 could have been more effective if planned around certain knowledge of German fuel crisis rather than cautious acknowledgement of possible German fuel problems. That difference mattered. Cost casualties that might have been prevented. Extended operations that might have been shorter. The institutional resistance to accepting her accurate analysis had operational costs measured in lives and time. Price never knew the full impact of her work, died 12 years before declassification, revealed that military historians credited her analysis with influencing operations that saved thousands of Allied lives, never knew that intelligence historians would use her case to teach about institutional bias against unconventional expertise, never knew that her February 1943 fuel report would be studied as example of how single analyst with specialized skills can identify strategic vulnerabilities. That entire intelligence apparatus misses. She knew only that she had been right, that proving she was right had required 8 months of institutional resistance, that being right wasn't enough when institutions were designed to filter uncomfortable truth through skepticism that delayed action. Eleanor Price fought her war with spreadsheets and arithmetic, won battles by calculating that Germany was running out of fuel faster than it could produce more, and saved thousands of lives. Through accounting analysis that institutions initially dismissed because accountants weren't supposed to understand military operations better than generals did.